Hi, my name is Zach. Welcome to my presentation on competence to consent to research. We'll be covering a litany of subtopics today, starting with competency to consent to research. Well, it started in the wake of World War II. After the horrific human atrocities that Nazi Germany carried out in the sake of research, the Nuremberg trial set out a code, a set of regulations that helped to make sure that research was always carried out fairly and humanely. These regulations is regulated by the Department of Health and Human Services, or the HHS. These are almost always adopted by federal agencies, but these regulations were also reviewed by the IRB, or IRBs, as these are local institutional review boards. Sometimes regulations can change depending on the IRB. However, the HHS always sets out the concrete rules that must be followed. These rules cover several disclosures that are required for any research project. The first of these rules is explanation. The purposes of the research, the duration of the participation, description of the procedure, and identification of any and all experiments carried out during the research must be identified. The foreseeable risks, as well as discomforts, must be disclosed to the participant, as well as the benefits, not only to the participant for undergoing this research, but the potential benefits that can help those also suffering from this condition, disease, or anything of the like. Alternative procedures or treatments, in some cases, must be disclosed to the participant, as well as the confidentiality agreement that the participant either benefits from or has to undergo. Which of the information is confidential and which is not. Compensation has to be disclosed, either for participating or in the case of an injury. And the researcher always has to be willing to answer questions. Directly, of course, but a contact line has to be created so that later a participant can ask questions and direct their questions to this line of contact. There also has to be a clear statement that the research participation is voluntary. This is arguably the most important disclosure. There's additional elements as well, but it depends if these are included. Usually they're included when appropriate and at the IRB's requirements. Pregnancy, what will happen if the participant becomes pregnant during the research, as well as the reasons or circumstances that a researcher might terminate the subject's participation. The costs that might accrue to the subject during research must be disclosed, as well as any of the new findings that the research might find and what that could mean for future participation. Oftentimes, the sample size, or the number of subjects in the study, is also disclosed. There's additional groups of people who research impacts in very different ways. Research in prisoners is strictly prohibited, except in a small number of circumstances. The research has to be directly related to studying criminal behavior or incarceration. If, for instance, it was research on a cancer drug, then no research can be done on prisoners. But if it was research done on the mental health of inmates at different prisons, then this research might be allowed on certain prisoners. The risks also have to be the same for non-prisoners or prisoners. Prisoners can't be treated to any undue risks that wouldn't be extended to other research participants. And no incentives can be offered for participation that would unduly influence decisions whether to participate. Children are another research group that there's some gray area and some difficulty in research. Research requires the assent of the child and permission of the parent. However, this can sometimes be waived by the local IRB depending on the research in question. If it could harm the child, then parent permission might be waived, i.e., neglected or abused children. And anything more than minimal risk is generally frowned upon, but this is up to the local IRB. Mentally infirm is a group where research is stunted a bit. One would often think that the Department of Health and Human Services, or the HHS, would implement specific research protocols and protections, like with prisoners or children, that help vulnerable groups stay unexploited by research. However, proposed regulations have not been implemented at this time. Speaking of the mentally infirm, there are serious disorders that can impact how ready someone is to participate in research. Alzheimer's, schizophrenia, and depression are just three of them. When measuring someone's capacity to consent, which is something that you have to worry about, these mental illnesses can provide serious roadblocks in such measuring. Alzheimer's, for instance, often displays repeated and aggressive memory loss. You likely know this, but such a mental illness or disorder can really hurt someone's measurement for the capacity to consent. Those suffering from Alzheimer's usually perform significantly worse than those suffering from schizophrenia. And likewise, those suffering from schizophrenia perform worse than those suffering from depression. In fact, people with depression are often shown to have good competence-related skills. A lot of this can be mitigated with education. Poor performance on a measurement at the very start doesn't necessarily mean that the person or participant is unable to consent to research. Ongoing dialogue is needed, both at the start and during the research. Those with mental disorders often fluctuate their mental faculties, and so ongoing dialogue is needed. At the very start, someone has a poor capacity to consent. This can be mitigated with education. Educating someone on what the risks are and reiterating information on the research study has been shown by research to significantly improve the capacity to consent. Children, likewise, can also consent to research. Elementary school age children don't have any significant less competency than adults. However, it is important to know that this age bracket has certain difficulties. A child can understand why research is important, why it's being done, but will sometimes not fully grasp the different risks or the benefits that participating in such research can do. Also, children are much more likely to stop their participation in research if they're told that the experimenter would not be upset if they stopped. This factors into ongoing dialogue. There's also the danger of a misconception. A therapeutic misconception is where many of the participants who participate in research misunderstand that they're participating in research and believe that they're receiving treatment. Again, ongoing dialogue and education are needed to mitigate this. In the evaluation of if someone is competent to consent to research, it can be easy to mirror the consent to research and the consent to treatment. There are several similarities. However, there are also very large differences as well. Consent to research and consent to treatment, while fundamentally can look very similar, they're often not. Freedom both to withdraw and set limits is very important, and various assessment instruments have been developed to help with this case. The MACAT-CR, or MacArthur Competence Assessment Tool for Clinical Research, is one such tool. Administration time for such a tool is usually 15 to 20 minutes and has high internal validity. This can improve both the competency of most individuals as well as accurately assess the competency to consent. It's very similar to the MACAT-T, which is the MacArthur Competence Assessment Tool for treatment, and has multiple competency-related abilities that the tool will test for. The main goal of such a tool is to make sure that someone is competent to give informed consent. This structured measure is helpful for consistency, and examiners' attitudes are also scrutinized. Consenting to research is incredibly important. As we saw before, horrible human violations have been enacted in the past, and it's our job to make sure that something like that doesn't happen again, both legally and morally. Thank you so much for watching my Competency to Consent to Research presentation. There's some fantastic information that you can also find in a variety of other sources. If you'd like to see some of this put out in front of you as an example, I linked a video in the description, Elements of a Successfully Informed Consent video. This was made by the National Institute of Mental Health and can be a significant help to this subject.